Continuing on, so going back to this picture, we have normal hormones that feed into receptor cells, and then we have endocrine disruptors that can fit into that same receptor and cause the cell to do something it shouldn't be doing. It could be causing it to produce abnormal sperm in a testis cell. It could be causing it to produce eggs that are not ready to be produced yet. It can cause young people to go through puberty earlier. And this is all new science. This is stuff that really hasn't come out except for the past 10 to 20 years. And we don't have a lot of good laws regulating endocrine disruptors. And we kind of have a problem in the US with cancers, with girls and boys, especially girls going through puberty earlier and starting their periods earlier. And doctors have been very concerned about this in the last 20 or so years. A lot of people think it is endocrine disruptors, and we still need to do a lot more research to see if that is true or not. Let's talk about how this works. In a regular toxin like lead or mercury or even caffeine is a toxin, isn't that kind of crazy? The dose makes the poison. For example, here's a little graph. The higher the dose, the more problems you have or death. So a low dose of mercury is going to give you a little bit of problems. More dose, higher dose of mercury, higher dose of mercury or lead, and it might cause death. Endocrine disruptors are different. Endocrine disruptors have the opposite effect. In high doses, the immune system kicks in and it fights off that chemical. But in low levels, it mimics hormones and causes problems. So here, it's the opposite problems. In low dose, this would be a tiny dose of an endocrine disruptor, you're going to have a problem or death. And in high levels, the immune system kicks in and it fights it off. And so our laws have become antiquated. Our laws say, test these chemicals before they go on the shelf at Target or Walmart or even for manufacturing. It says test them in higher and higher and higher amounts and see, what amount it takes to kill them. The law doesn't say test it in tiny amounts to see if it messes up the endocrine system. So we need to change our laws, but there's a lot of fighting back from chemical companies who don't want to change the laws and check on this. This is a famous guy right here. His name is Tyrone Hayes. He works at UC Berkeley, and he was the one who found out that there's a fertilizer called atrazine that was causing frogs to become hermaphrodites and have sex deformities caused by tiny amounts of atrazine, so it's an endocrine disruptor. Here's another piece of evidence we have. The sperm count in humans has been declining for the past decade or so. And the hypothesis is, again, there's something in our environment that's messing up the hormonal system. For guys, you have rates of, I believe this is testicular cancer. Yes, testicular cancer has gone up higher and higher and higher, and it could be due to these endocrine disruptors. So make sure you know about atrazine, a fertilizer that causes sex deformalities in frogs and alligators. Make sure you know this chart. And the decline in sperm count is one piece of evidence that there's something going on in our environment with these chemicals, and also increasing testicular cancer is another piece of evidence. Turning the page. Bisphenol A is known also as BPA. It's been in the news a lot. It's a potential, possible, probable. Most scientists think it's probably a huge endocrine disruptor. The research is not complete yet to know for sure, but it's probable. It's found in plastics, the inner lining of steel cans, and on your receipt tape. You know that the receipt tape is nice and shiny now, and it has BPA in it. Last year, California banned BPA in children's products like baby bottles and sippy cups, and that's a good start. Whenever you buy something plastic to eat out of, please make sure that you check and see if it is BPA free. It will say it if it is. And make sure it's from a reputable company that you believe when they say it's BPA free. Also, some stores like Whole Foods and their canned products will not allow the inner lining to have BPA in it. See, steel cans of food, cans of soup or chili or vegetables, they're lined in plastic inside to prevent rusting, and so that lining can have BPA in it. Turn the page. We have all kinds of ways that toxins can get into the human. Take a look at this chart through products, workplaces, medicines, pesticides, wastes, and it can get into our food, can get into the air, and eventually into humans. We talked about indicator species in a previous chapter, and this particular paragraph talks about why they are really good indicator species of toxins in the environment. All right, so going on to the next page here, page 415, we have this picture here of the North Pole and how toxins tend to concentrate up in the North Pole. So the North Pole has large levels of toxins, including PCB, and it's due to the atmospheric and ocean currents that tend to bring it up there. So what does this mean? Well, polar bears, walruses, seals, etc., and the Inuit people, these are the Eskimos, they're called Inuit, and they live all here up in the Arctic Circle, not just in like Alaska, but northern Canada, northern Russia, Siberia. That's where the Inuit live. They have high levels of toxins in their blood and their breast milk. This process that is described here in this picture is called global distillation. Make sure you know this term, global distillation. Another term you need to know is a POP, a POP. And this is not in your book, but you need to know it. We call it a persistent organic pollutant. And they're found up in the North Pole in huge amounts. They resist degradation, which means they don't break down very quickly. They remain in a whole toxic state for a long time. There's low water solubility, which means that they don't dissolve in waters. They dissolve in oils, and there's not a whole lot of oils, in the environment, just in the oceans or the atmosphere. So they're going to stay whole for a while, and they will survive long-range transport up to the North Pole. So in the North Pole, you're going to find a lot of POPs. This is just a note for me to show a little video when we discuss this in class. Turning the page, let's talk about two terms. All right. This particular picture here is bioaccumulation and biomagnification, but first let's talk about toxins persisting in the environment. Some last a long time, and when they finally do break down, they degrade, they break down into things that are also toxic. For example, DDT will eventually break down into DDE, and both of these are toxic. So even though it breaks down, the product is also toxic as well. And why DDT is bad is because it makes the shells weak in bald eagles and the osprey and the brown pelican, the peregrine falcon. You have to know all four because all four are have problems with DDT and can be asked about on the AP test. So how does this process happen? Well, there's two terms you need to know, bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So the first term here, you have, let's say, DDT that gets into your water, so it's sprayed on crops. Well, it used to be. It would spray on crops, and then the rain would come and wash the DDT into the waters, and the waters would get infested, either the rivers or the lakes, or eventually the ocean. And the zooplankton and the phytoplankton would take it in, their bodies here. And it's at a very low concentration here. 0.00003 parts per million. That's very, very low. That's in the water. But by the time the plankton get this toxin, it's now concentrated in their bodies at 0.04 parts per million. And so every time the zooplankton absorb water, they're absorbing more DDT. This process is called bioaccumulation. Then the small fish eat zooplankton and they start to accumulate it in their bodies. And so small fish on average will have 0.5 parts per million in their body, which, doesn't kill them off. They can tolerate 0.5 parts per million. Now, these fish are eaten by large fish, and the large fish have to eat a bunch of small fish, and every time they eat a small fish, that DDT accumulates in their bodies. And so because they eat a lot of the small fish and it just stays there and accumulates, you now have it at 2 parts per million. And then going up to this osprey, the osprey is going to eat a lot of large fish and it's going to accumulate in its body at 25 parts per million. So this osprey now will have high levels of DDT in its body, and when the mama bird lays her eggs, the egg shells are weak, and when she sits on the eggs to incubate them, they crack and the birds die. So this is why the osprey, the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, etc. have become endangered and almost extinct because there was no babies being born. So this process of accumulating the DDT in the bodies is called bioaccumulation. When the numbers keep going higher up a food chain, that's called biomagnification. And so you must know these two terms and specifically what they mean. So we have our top predatory birds that, fish and birds have high levels of toxins. So your fish, it's not just your birds, but your fish too. So if there's mercury in the water, which there is, by the way, and this mercury comes from burning coal. So when we burn coal to generate electricity, then the mercury becomes airborne, and then the rain takes it down to the water, and then you have this whole biomagnification thing, and it ends up in your top predatory fish. So tuna and swordfish are notoriously bad for mercury. You should not have huge amounts of tuna. Just a little bit a week, a can or two. In fact, on the web, you can find tuna calculators to see for your weight and for your sex how much tuna you should have in a week that your body can handle the mercury. Swordfish is another top predatory fish that tends to accumulate mercury as well. All right, on page 417, we're studying the effects of hazards now. Sewage runoff. Okay, so if you have sewage that is not treated and goes right into the ocean, it can contain toxoplasmia. This is a parasite that kills California sea otters. And it comes from cat litter boxes. So people who live near the coast, if they dump their cat litter into the storm drains or just outside and it washes into a river and to the sea, it can infest California sea otters. And what happens is that they get seizures. And when they have a seizure, they can drown because they can't keep their head above the water and breathe. It's very sad. Turning the page to page 418, we have a very good example of an epidemiological study. We can't test humans for toxins. We can test rats and mice and other critters, but we can't spray a bunch of humans with, a chemical or expose them in some way to some sort of chemical and see what happens. So instead, we look at an exposure that's already happened. So somewhere there's been an accident or on purpose, people have used chemicals and bad things have happened, and we call these an epidemiological study. And so, normal children that were not exposed to pesticide drew normal pictures, and the kids that were exposed to pesticide were developmentally delayed. They had learning disabilities, and this is a very good example of an epidemiological study.